Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Ekamra Sports Literature Festival. I am Preeti Dahiya, and for this session, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce to all of you our guest for this session, Mr. Andrew Downie. Andrew, welcome and congratulations on another wonderful book.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invite and the kind words.
Right. So, just at the start of this session, for everybody's reference, let me just say that we are going to today talk about Andrew's second book, which is The Greatest Show on Earth, The Inside Story of the Legendary 1970 World Cup. And of course, Andrew, it's not a secret, has written another wonderful book before this, and that was on the Brazilian football legend Socrates. So, Andrew, let me begin by asking you this. Where did the idea of writing on the 1970 World Cup really originate from? Was it always there with you, or you basically thought about it when you wrote your first book, Socrates?
Well, there's two answers to that question, really. The first one, more pragmatically, was that a publisher came to me and said, we would like you to do this book about the 1970 World Cup, an oral history. What do you think? And I knew a little bit about this publisher. They have done in the past quite a few books about oral histories, a lot of them about rugby. And I think they felt that this was a new kind of way to tell stories, just in the words of the protagonists, the players and the coaches, and the people that were there and took part in the games and knew all the inside stories. And so I knew the format. And of course, I also knew all about the 1970 World Cup. I'm too young to remember the 1970 World Cup, as you can see, but I knew from growing up that this was one of the most iconic World Cups of all time, because even as a kid, people would talk about Pele. And I remember as a boy growing up in Scotland, memorizing the name Edson Arantes do Nascimento, Pele's full name. And this was always something that had in my head. It was like this mystical name for me. So I always knew that the 1970 World Cup was a special World Cup.
Indeed. Indeed. So Andrew, let's talk about the book now. When one reads through the book, it straddles through two eras. You can clearly make out that there was one in which the book goes through the period when color television really was used as a broadcast medium for the football World Cup, and then the first time the yellow cards were given, and in the end, like you mentioned, you do realize it was Pele's last World Cup. So. As a boy going through those memories, was it something that really became one of the reasons behind putting all these things together, or was it the reason?
Well, I think the reason that the 1970 World Cup is so iconic, is so remembered today, is because it came, as you say, right on that period between, as football changed. Football was, for most of its history up until the 1970s, it was a sport with a little bit of business thrown in now and again. But from 1970, that's when it started to change. That's when money started to come into football. You started to see the very first signs of sponsorship, the very first signs of money creeping in. And of course, that led us to the football we have today, where football is, in my opinion, it's 90% business and it's 10% sport. The whole formula has changed. The equation has changed to be all about business and just a little bit about sport. But 1970 was that moment, and I think largely because of television, as you said, it was the first World Cup to be broadcast live around the world in color, and so people were seeing football teams and football matches. They saw the turf was green. They saw Brazil primarily in that famous yellow shirt. Even Brazilians didn't see, Brazil in yellow. They would see it in a kind of grainy, grey, black and white on the television. I think once the world saw Brazil in this gorgeous yellow shirt, that's the memory that has stuck in people's minds ever since. And now we associate, when we think about Brazil and Brazilian football, we think about that beautiful yellow shirt. And that all dates from 1970.
So suddenly, would you say that that made people realize that their heroes are so much more real? It brought them closer to their heroes, and that's something that has to be put on paper.
Yes, I think so, because I think people, it's one thing seeing something in black and white, and
Right.
the grainy, and the pictures aren't very great. It's harder to identify with something like that. But when you see something as it's supposed to be seen, as you would see it if it was right in front of you, I think that makes a big difference, and I think that identification was always there. Plus, you have the other factor is that 1970 was all about. It's remembered for that Brazilian team, and particularly for Pelé.
Right.
So the team was so memorable, so wonderful, that
I
has
think
also stuck in people's minds.
I think it's beautiful the way you put it all in the book. And everything about the World Cup is so much more memorable. There's every episode that has so many things associated with it. So I'm going to come to another episode that you devote quite a lot of space to in your book, and that's the Emerald Bracelet episode that went missing. So this was as per the shop owner in the hotel where the English team was staying, and Bobby Moore was accused of stealing it. You write about it in quite a bit of detail in your book, and there is also reference to a Garden article that says that it was a bracelet with 12 diamonds and 12 emeralds, worth at that point in time 650 pounds. Now just give us a bit of a sense to that episode. Was it a prank? Was it a conspiracy theory to put England on the back foot, who were the reigning world champions at that time? What was it?
Well, I think the only true answer that anybody can give is that no one knows 100%. I think the key fact, I think, in all this was that, remember, England were the world champions.
Right.
So they came to Colombia. This happened only about 10 days, 2 weeks before the World Cup kicked off. England were in Colombia because they were doing some high altitude training there, some matches, preparing for the high altitude of Mexico. And of course, you had this incident. Bobby Moore was arrested. He was taken into custody. He was quickly released, and then he was arrested again. And there was this allegation that he'd stolen this bracelet. And the England players at the time said, we didn't know what was going on. The England team eventually, most of the team, flew to Mexico, and they left Bobby Moore in the custody of the Colombian police. He was actually allowed into the house arrest. He was overseen by one of the officials from the Colombian Football Association. So he was kind of training in the house, in the back garden, in these incredible circumstances. And this was now only a week before the World Cup. What happened is, most of the players will tell you, or did say, they said that they thought it was a ruse to try and get some money out of the players, that they wanted the players to just say, okay, we want this to be all over and done with. Here's some money. Let's just forget about it. The players said, listen, we're innocent. We don't want anything to do with that. We're not going to pay because we've done nothing wrong. And eventually, when it became clear that that was going to happen, some of the alleged eyewitnesses disappeared. The evidence all all fell apart. The case fell apart, and Bobby
This is
Moore
so
was
fascinating.
released. And he arrived in Mexico something like three or 4 days before England's first game. And when he arrived, England team gave him a hero's welcome. And it was really incredible that Bobby Moore turned out for England just a few days later and played with the same coolness and class that he always showed on the field.
This is absolutely fascinating, and for a generation that was born after that World Cup, I think just to read about this entire episode and these details of 1970 World Cup is going to make it so much more fascinating, really. But in your research, Andrew, you must have gone deeper into what really happened at that point in time. And I'm going to quote a bit from, Moore's biography. His biographer writes, and I quote, Powell suggested Moore had confessed before his death in 1993 that a bracelet may have indeed existed. Perhaps one of the younger lads with the squad did something foolish, a prank with unfortunate circumstances. So after all of this entire controversy, well, something could have actually happened.
Exactly, and we will never know, because the players, most of them are not with us from 1970, and a lot of the ones that are, have unfortunately health problems and memory problems. But I don't
Yeah.
think we'll ever find out what actually happened. I mean, in Matt Dickinson's biography of Bobby Moore and Moore's own book, and Moore actually wrote his own book all about the 1970 World Cup, which is one of the most interesting things that we can get to in a second. But all these things, they all come out with little details, and yet we will never 100% know exactly what happened unless one of the players comes out and finally says, this actually happened, this was a prank, or we did this as a joke. Until then, we'll never really know.
It's actually incredible. The way you put it, it's incredible. And one has to read it the way you've written about it to, really relive that bit of history in the book. I'm going to talk about a bit here on the England team. They were the reigning world champions. We've spoken about it. And they were doing pretty well till they ran into Germany. And that was in the quarterfinals. And they were leading at 2-0 at halftime, I think. And before they went on to lose 3-2. And that was in extra time. So it was quite an interesting turn of events for England at that point in time. Now, one has to think here, what if Gordon Banks had not fallen ill before the match with an upset stomach? I think you've written about it, severe upset stomach he had. And do you think that would have really changed the result somewhere? Their fortunes would have been different if that hadn't happened?
Yeah, that is the $64,000 question. Remember,
Not
Gordon
a
Banks.
£650 question.
Yeah, exactly. Gordon Banks at the time was one of the best, if not the best, goalkeeper in the world. And just a few days earlier, he had made that remarkable save from Pele in the game against England. So, as Bobby Charlton says in the book, when the players found out that Gordon Banks was going to miss the game, Charlton said, listen, nobody said anything, but we were all thinking, anybody but Gordon Banks. Anybody can be out, just don't let it be Gordon Banks, because they knew that he was such a key player in the team and they had such confidence in Banks. And the player that came in, Peter Bonetti, there was two other goalkeepers in the squad. There was Peter Bonetti from Chelsea and Alex Stepney of Manchester United. And Bonetti got the nod ahead. And one of the players, England players, Francis Lee, he said to me, listen, I think that was a mistake because Stepney had played more recently. But he said it's a lot like today. The media are based in London, and Chelsea was it wasn't as big a name then as it is today, but Chelsea was still a big club, arguably as big as Manchester United at the time. And they said, listen, the London media was pressuring for Bonetti, and they were quite pleased that Bonetti got in, but he reckons that was a mistake.
Very, very interesting. Another beautiful episode written so well by you. There is another very beautiful line in the book that I want to read out right now for those of our friends who are listening to us and watching us. Describing an England versus Brazil match, you say that the country that invented the game against the country that perfected it. Now, that was back in 1970. If you were to write about an England and Brazil match now, would you use the same words?
Essentially, yes. I mean, England, likes to see itself as the home of football for obvious reasons, but Brazil also likes to see itself as maybe the home. Brazil likes to see itself as the home of the beautiful game, and I like to think of Brazil as the spiritual home of football, if not the place where football started. And I should say as a joke, I'm Scottish, as you can all tell by my accent. And the man who brought football to Brazil was Charles Miller, who is the son of a Scot. So I always tell my Brazilian friends, I lived in Brazil for 20 years. I always say that the Brazilians taught the Scots taught the Brazilians how to play football, and the Brazilians have perfected it a little bit since.
Fantastic. There you end up scoring a goal over them, I believe. Let's talk about the Brazil versus England match then. The match eventually that was won by Brazil 1-0. And in talking about this particular match, you write that this match was a match that was remembered not because of the goal that was scored, but because of a goal that wasn't. Now, you're of course referring to the Pele header that Banks saved. So it's talked about as one of the greatest saves ever. Do you want to, read for us, perhaps from your book, the way you describe it? Can we do that?
Yeah, I'll need to find it exactly where it is. You'll need to let me think.
Take your time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot written about it. Well, there's a lot written about it. Pele said that Banks made what was, to my mind, the best save of the World Cup, not because it was my header. I just am recognizing the fact. The header was hard, surprisingly hard, and in the corner, the keeper's dive was instantaneous and efficient. And then Nobby Stiles, the England defender, said, when he saved from Pele, more brilliantly it seemed than any goalkeeper had ever saved before, we leapt up from the bench and shook our heads in wonderment. Banksy, in his rather dour way, said he didn't really know what all the fuss was about. He was merely doing his job, and if anyone cared to remember, he had made equally good saves back at home in bread and butter league games. That was, I think, representative of Gordon Banks, who was a very humble and unassuming man who remained friends with Pele for many, many years afterwards. They became close friends, and I think they were tied together by that remarkable moment.
What an understated way of really, talking about the greatest saves ever in the beautiful game. I mean, fantastic, particularly that quote from Banks.
And it's really, sorry, Preeti, it's really interesting that when we think about Pele and we think about his greatness, a lot of what we think about are not the more than 1,000 goals he scored. It's the 3 or 4 goals that he never scored. And a lot of them were in this World Cup. It was the save that Banks made. It was the shot from the halfway line, remember, that just went over the bar against, I think it was Czechoslovakia. It was the play against Uruguay when he dummied the ball and then had the open goal and just clipped it past the post. And these were all things that someone scoring from the halfway line is fairly common now. But back in 1970, it wasn't. It wasn't common at all, and it certainly wasn't common to see it on television. And Pele was doing these things, for the first time. It was the first time people around the world had ever seen this kind of brazen, audaciousness. And I think that's one of the reasons that Pele is so remembered in that World Cup.
Andrew, I have to ask you this. We all talk about the fact that with this 1970 World Cup, the way football is watched completely changed because it was available to all the viewers in instead of black and white in color. Somewhere, you think that was also playing on the mind of the players during the 1970 World Cup, the legendary players at that time? Does it affect them? The way you are reaching your fans' homes?
I don't think so. I think the players, once they're out on the field, I think they're focused on the game.
No added pressure?
Sorry?
No added pressure on them?
I don't think so. I mean, none of them mentioned that they felt added pressure because the game was broadcast live and in colour. Some of the 1966 games were broadcast live in England, for example, so it wouldn't have made a huge difference to the England players. I think once they're out there, they're focused on the game and they've forgotten about these other issues that are just periphery to the 90 minutes.
All right, let's move on to the semi-final then. Italy versus Germany, also known as the match of the century. And this is the match that Italy won 4-3, 5 of the 7 goals really coming in extra time. So now, any other match, Andrew, that we can equate with that match in modern football? Anything that comes to your mind?
That's a good question. As exciting as that. Hibs against Motherwell in the Scottish Premier League that ended 6-6. I'm a Hibs supporter, so that's the game I remember as probably the greatest Scottish League game of modern times. It ended 6 goals each. Games that people would remember. I'm not I don't watch a lot of English football. So I don't know what would be a kind of equivalent. I mean, basically what you're talking about is a game that really went, backwards and forwards. One team would
Right.
score, and then another team would run up and equalise, and then the other team would make it 2-1. Then it would be 3-2 and 4-3, 4-3. It was real, backwards and forwards, and it looked like it was going to be goals every couple of minutes. Most of the I think the big games of recent times, at least the ones that I can remember, I'm trying to think of games such as Barcelona PSG back in 2017. Liverpool against Barcelona 2 or 3 years ago. Bayern against Barcelona just recently. All these games were they were not as tight as I remember. It was always one team. It was one team coming back, one team winning the first leg, another team coming back, that kind of thing. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure people watching this are going, well, how can he not remember this game when it was?
No. It wasn't to put you in a tight spot. I just wanted to understand the kind of stakes that were involved in this particular semi-final. It was a semi-final of the 1970 World Cup. And I think there are very few examples in contemporary football that would come close to such a battle. Fortunes changing every minute, every second. Fine, I'll give it to you there. I just want to move on now and, really ask you about how does someone who's chronicling such a huge event go about his work? Did you have to watch minute by minute footage of all the big matches, at least, that you were writing about? How did you go through the process?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's lots of different factors involved here. I tried to watch as many of the games as possible. A lot of them are available on YouTube, and a few of them, kind of fortuitously were shown on the television in Brazil and elsewhere during the start of the pandemic, when there was a lot of space on the schedules. Some of the TV companies, they would show old games, and in Brazil, for example, they showed a lot of the games from 1970. So it was possible to see a lot of the games, although not all of them. Mm-hmm. What I tried to do here is, when I first started the book, my first thought was, this is going to be a dream come true. I'm going to travel around the world and meet legends and talk to them about great games in the 1970 World Cup. And it soon became clear to me that was impossible, mostly because of money. It just wasn't feasible to travel, and I never had the money to go to Italy, to Germany, to Uruguay, to all these places. Also, 1970, it's a long time ago now. So a lot of these players are no longer with us. A lot of the players who are still with us have health problems, don't always remember all the details of the games. And some of the players, especially in Brazil, they expect to be paid for their recollections. So it was hard to get a lot of first-hand interviews. Mm-hmm. So I did two things. First of all, I knew some of the Brazilians, so I was able to speak to some of the Brazilians. But because I lived in Brazil, I knew where a lot of the old archive interviews were. So I would go to the archives and I would go through interviews of the players talking about this in years gone by. I went through as many autobiographies of the players as I could. So I got their recollections from their first-hand autobiographies. And then the other really key thing was, I didn't want this to be a book just about Brazil or just about England or just about Italy, the 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 big teams. I wanted to tell the stories of the smaller teams involved as well. Teams like El Salvador, teams like Belgium and Sweden and Israel, for example. Israel, their only ever appearance at the World Cup. So what I tried to do is, when I wasn't able to track down players myself, I would find a journalist or a researcher in these countries, and I would hire them to find a player and to go. I would send the questions and they would go and talk to the player and then send me the interview. And that got some fantastic information, because, somebody in Bulgaria, for example, will know some of the Bulgarian players from 1970. So they have a relationship with them. The players will be more open with these guys. And that really worked. I mean, one of the Bulgarians were telling me about how they did their training in the hills in Bulgaria in the snow. and yet they were preparing at altitude for a World Cup that was taking place in the 35-degree heat of Mexico. The Bulgarians, they didn't know about the teams they were playing. They would get some of their scouting reports from Bulgarian diplomats who were in, Mexico, for example, or Brazil or Italy, and the diplomats would go to games and call back and say, this player's good, this player's not so good. So these are the kind of differences that you would see between modern football and football back then, where it's another world. It's completely different.
But and let me tell our viewers that there are plenty of player interviews that Andrew has managed, and we see them in the book when we read it. And the story behind those interviews from the man himself, the author, telling us, of course, what were the means that he had to use to get those fantastic interviews. Now, I want to come to the final, that eventually Brazil won quite comfortably. So my question is actually on Pele. To your mind, do you think he should have continued till 1974 World Cup? He did continue to play in 71 and for Santos in 1974 as well. So, what was it? According to you, he should have continued?
Well, first of all, after the 1966 World Cup, remember, this was Pele's fourth World Cup in 1970. He had won as a 17-year-old in 58. He had taken part in 1962, but he was injured in the second game. In 1966, Brazil were knocked out in the first round, and it was a World Cup where there was an awful lot of fouling. There was a lot of violence, and Pele was injured in two of the games that Brazil played. And Pele had it in his mind after 1966 that he wouldn't play the World Cup ever again. He believed that the World Cup was bad luck for him because of 62 and 66, and he didn't want anything to do with it. He had also just had a kid. He wanted to spend more time at home, so he said, listen, I'm not playing international football again. And for 2 years, Pele, between 66 and 68, he didn't play for Brazil. That he was convinced to come back. And one of the reasons for him coming back was he thought, okay, I'm going to come back. I'm going to win the World Cup for the third time. No one's done it before. And then once I've done that, that's it. I can retire. And that's exactly what he did. And I think he knew what he wanted. He knew what he wanted to do, and he wasn't going to be swayed. And the Brazilian president at the time in 1974 came to him and said, we really need you for the World Cup. Would you please come back? And Pele said, no, I'm not coming back. And it caused a lot of problems in Brazil because a lot of Brazilians were quite upset with him. They knew that the Brazil team in 74 wasn't as good as 1970. They knew that Pele was still playing football. He was still, he was still fit. As Rivellino said to me, he said, listen, the World Cup is a short tournament. Pele was fit. He could have come and he could have played in those 6 games and he would have made an enormous difference. But Pele had made up his mind and he wasn't going to be swayed.
So somewhere one feels that he didn't want to jinx it after being third time lucky and winning the 71 World Cup. Your thoughts on that? I mean, somewhere, personally, a player has achieved the ultimate thing that he wanted to achieve in his career. And then beyond that, he has nothing to prove maybe, or, get for his country. How would one really justify that decision?
Because he wanted to go out on a high. He didn't want to fail, and because he thought that if he failed in 74, people would remember the failure in 74. They wouldn't remember the glory of 1970.
I think that's a perfect answer. I think that really summarizes what really went behind that unconventional decision, or a decision that not many were very happy with. Let's come back to the book, Andrew, and I want to talk about the format that you have taken for your book, an oral history rather than the conventional method of writing a book as such. What do you think has been the response really, and how is it different from your first book?
Yeah, I mean, it's very different because it's, first of all, it's a lot easier to do in the sense that you don't have to plan quite so much. You don't have to be quite as creative with the narrative. You don't have to put thoughts into people's heads. All you're doing is relating what's there. And this book was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal recently, and the the guy who wrote the review said something that I thought was really interesting. He said, Andrew Downie is the author, but we should think of him more as a curator, which I thought was perfect because, I write little bits in the book, but it really is me bringing together. This book is all about the research rather than the writing. And I think that's what makes it very interesting. Is someone else said to me, the only people who know are the people who were there. So this is a book, exclusively of people who were there.
Author/curator. That's very interesting. I mean, definitely. So now that brings me to the question that I'm not sure whether you're prepared to answer or not, but what is going to be your next project? Have you already thought about it?
I've thought about it, yeah. But yeah, I'm not. I can't really say yet because I don't know if it will actually come to fruition. It's been hard because I've been in London. I came to London just before the pandemic, expecting to go back to Brazil and to be able to do more work and more research, but the pandemic made that impossible. So things have come to a little bit of a halt. So fingers crossed that we'll have another Brazilian book for you sometime in the future.
We're all keeping our fingers crossed. And thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing your thoughts with all of us. It was just a fabulous time we had here and a pleasure to really connect with you. Thank you for coming to Ekamra Sports Literature Festival. And I really hope that we connect again. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti, and thanks very much for the invite.